Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I am so excited today to have as my guest, Trevor Timbeck. Trevor, welcome to my show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I am beyond excited. I don't know what word that would be. Let's just say I'm very enthused, and I know my audience is going to be too as we get into our conversation. I want to tell my audience a little bit about you and how we got connected. I learned about Trevor when I read this wonderful book, The Power of Systems, which Trevor co-authored with my very favorite author, Steve Chandler. And this may sound familiar to you because I interviewed Steve very recently for episode 300, and we talked about the book. Today, Trevor and I are going to explore different things related to the book, along with other topics. And I want you to know a little bit about who he is before we get started. To me, from our conversations we've had so far, Trevor is an absolutely remarkable human being with important insights, not just about the power of systems, but on life itself. And as you'll see, on leadership too. I know you're going to find this conversation really valuable, and I would suggest you watch it or listen to it without any distractions. Trevor has a deep technical background, and he started his career as a software engineer. He was promoted to leadership roles and eventually became head of sales and then chief talent officer with a large IT company. Today, Trevor has a very successful leadership coaching practice. And if I'm not mistaken, Trevor, all of your clients come from referrals from others who have worked with you. So you'll see why as we get into our conversation. We're going to talk about the book today and how it ties in with who you are being as a human being and also as a leader and what you're creating in the world. This book and Trevor have had impact on my life that I would consider profound, and I think you're going to find that to be the same way. So, Trevor, that's quite a buildup, but I feel I speak the truth on this.
Well, I love how you create me. So thank you.
I love your statement there. So let's go back and talk about your journey into leadership and then how it evolved into the coaching practice you have today.
Okay. Where would you like me to start?
Well, let's just start with how you evolved from the engineering, the software engineering into leadership. What led to that transition?
Yeah. So initially, when I went to university, and it's reminding me because my son is now entering university, I wanted to go into business school, which is his plan as well. And as I was at university, I just fell in love with this subject called computer science and actually switched over to math and then full-time computer science. And I just loved solving problems and technology. But as I was doing that career, I started to realize, it's kind of funny to say, but computers and technology are deterministic, which means they're almost too easy to figure out. This is how it started to occur to me. And so I went back and did my MBA. And my takeaway from my MBA was business is all about people. My wife jokes and doesn't always love that I spent that much money to come away with it's all about people. But what I loved about people was they're non-deterministic. It means like they're not predictable. You can't just figure them out. You don't just program them the way a computer is. And if it's not working, debug it. And that was fun, but it wasn't as much fun as what I started to see that I wanted to get into the business side and the people side, which was initially my plan when I went to university. And so I moved out of a technical role into marketing initially and did what I love to do, which is I was taking a look at the big picture, analyzing our company at the time, really from a customer experience. What's the journey for the customer? And started to come up with some innovative ideas around how we could improve that. And my CEO at the time said, these are great ideas. The best way to implement this would be if you ran our renewal business, right? The sales arm that actually handled all of customer relationships and servicing customers and renewing them. I thought that was a great idea. I was very naive at the time. And all of a sudden, I had 40 people and $40 million of responsibility and had no idea how to run a sales organization. So I spent the next year of my career literally sweating through my suit every day, trying to figure things out. And luckily came across a book that I love called Coaching Salespeople into Sales Champions, and hired the author, who's a great coach named Keith Rosen, to come in and train me and my management team on this thing called coaching. And I got to work with Keith for the next year and a half and just fell in love with coaching.
One of the things that I think he helped you with was this whole idea that you didn't have to have all the answers. That was a belief that you had. Would you talk a little bit about what kind of a realization you came to and what that did for you as a leader?
Yeah, it was, now looking back, I can see that's why I was sweating through my suit every day for the first year, because up until that point in my schooling and all of my other careers, I'd always been paid for having the answers, knowing how to come up with things, figure things out. And in the sales role, I didn't have the answers. I couldn't figure things out. And I was desperately trying to. And in coaching with Keith one day, he said, "Oh, I see what the problem is." And I was just so excited that he might see some what the problem is. I said, "Okay, please tell me what the problem is." And he said, "Oh, you still think it's your job to have the answers." And for me, it was kind of like, duh. It's like he said, "You think you still need to keep breathing." And he said, "No, no, that's not your job anymore. You're the leader. Your job is to have the questions." And in that moment, the amount of relief and lightness, and for me, it was a transformative moment of, whether it was true or not, I just fell in love with the possibility that, one, there could be a job where your job is to have the questions, but also the sense of like, I was just totally not seeing something that was there all the time. And so for me, I talk about it in the book. It's like this flip it and reverse it, as you pointed out in your email. It's like switching from, okay, my job to have answers to my job to have questions. But really, the lesson there that I don't want people to take away of like, oh, that's what I need to do, ask questions. The lesson there for me was I was being so inauthentic. That was why I was literally sweating through my suit every day, because I was withholding and trying to hide the fact that I didn't have answers, but I had a ton of questions and I just simply wasn't asking them.
Mm.
So for me, the real shift was beginning to be authentic and just start to ask all the questions I had. And we uncovered lots of things. I also learned lots of things. And I saw that my job as the leader wasn't to fix things and tell people what to do. And it was a huge shift for me in my leadership, but also waking me up to this possibility of coach and working with people to help them have similar shifts.
I'd love for you to share what difference did it make with your team members, the people you were being inauthentic with when you were changing and making this transition to I think of the word relaxing into your
Yes.
role, that you had this pressure taken off of you to just be, and what that felt like to you, but also to the people you worked with.
Yeah, I love the question. It was definitely relaxing for me and them. And I think they all along could tell I didn't have the answers, and could pick up on the inauthenticity. That's what I always say to people. Like, when you're being inauthentic, people know. Um, and so I think there was a lot of relaxation on their part, permission for them to ask questions and not always need to have the answers too. And really, the context shifted to a learning environment. And what got created was a lot of learning, a lot of experiments, a lot of growth. And to me, I sort of then saw, oh, that's how I got that role, was because I was being really curious and say like, well, what is the customer experience? And what would happen if we did these other things? And just sort of forgot that when I moved over because I went back into a default of like, okay, now that I'm here, I must have the answers. And it just wasn't working, but I hadn't noticed.
Just imagining how that opened up. The word honesty is kind of a coming to mind as I'm listening to you and imagining an environment where people do feel like, oh, I am learning now, so it's safe to speak up and acknowledge when I don't know the answer to something.
Mhm.
Did you sense a difference in the whole culture and environment of your team and those that you worked with?
Yeah, we started implementing a lot more coaching, which helped the shift towards asking questions and creating a learning environment. And even how I was leading, Keith did a great job with helping me lead. And one of the things I saw was I wasn't always getting the feedback that I needed, or people weren't willing to tell me things I didn't want to hear. And so I started a system, I call it now, but a practice at the time of ending my team meetings with, okay, tell me something you think I don't want to hear. And of course, the
Mm.
first time I asked it, nobody had anything. And so I went back to my coach and said, well, I did it. And he laughed and he said, well, how many times? And I said, well, once. He's like, no, no, it will take weeks or months before someone might start answering that question until they know you're really serious and it's safe. And even then, they might tell you something that's not that much you want to hear. And so I had to just keep practicing, keep asking the question, keep sharing it, and sometimes just asking it in a different way so that my team really started to see that this wasn't a flavor of the day or, one thing. I was just attempting to get them to tell me something, but it was really this shift of, okay, we're not getting the feedback. And that's something that then really informed my role there. But also when I went into chief talent officer, I had always loved, when I did my MBA, there was a law called Packard's Law from Hewlett Packard, one of the founders of HP. And Packard's Law is something like no company can grow its revenue faster than it can grow its ability to find the right people. And I just loved something as simple as that and that you could have a law. So I created Timbeck's Law based on my last name when I was chief talent officer. And it ended up being Timbeck's Law was that 99.6% of all problems become and remain a problem because of lack of feedback. When I started saying it, it was something like 80%. It was more like Pareto's principle, 80-20. But every time I just kept running into like, oh, this is just lack of feedback. I increased it, and I stopped at 99.6 because I wanted to leave a little room for maybe there's something else.
And so, how did that play out in terms of the operation there and you're interacting with people? What did they absorb from that?
So the feedback when I was chief talent officer, people just started to see, and I didn't really get it the way I got it more clearly when I became a coach, was how leadership is a conversation. And it's all the conversations usually that we're not having that are causing the problems. And so at the time I was calling it feedback, but really what I saw was like, okay, there's just conversations and feedback and information and things that aren't circulating, right? And so one way to talk about an organization is, conversations are sort of like the lifeblood of a company. And when their conversations aren't happening, the blood's not flowing, right? And oxygen and information and everything we need to really operate effectively and efficiently kind of gets blocked up. And so it just started to open that up. But also, I noticed I then started having and doing a lot of coaching around conversations, right? And recommending people like the books I loved, like Crucial Conversations and all these other books on the art of conversation. And to me, it just really started to connect. Okay, that there's something about language and conversations and leadership that really then informed my coaching and the work that I love to do now. And even the book, The Power of Systems, I think on my LinkedIn profile, it says that I coach at the intersection of love, language, and leadership. And I just started to see these different areas and, where they intersect. But that was the beginning of my love of and recognizing the power of language and conversation.
I love that. Love, language, and leadership. Talk more about those three areas and their interconnectedness.
So love for me is the foundational one. And that's and I talk a lot about it in the book, the work of the Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana really opened my eyes up. He wrote a book called The Origin of Humanness in the Biology of Love, which sounds very technical, and the book is, but it really uncovered something for me and opened up that love is our fundament as humans, right? And when we go away from love, we get sick. And so then we have to return to love to heal. And when we leave love, we tend to use what I call force, right? When we force people to do stuff. And that was what I saw with leadership was it was typically command and control, authoritarian, which I now call not leadership. I say that's not leadership. That's command and control. That's dictatorship, authoritarianism. That's something else than leadership. And it really got me inspired. At the time, I didn't see it this way through this lens of love, but of like, okay, that's not working. What is actual leadership? What is the kind of leadership that inspires and enrolls people and doesn't require force and obedience and punishments? And so to me, love is the recognition that that's who we are as humans. That's just what returns us to health and well-being. But that also is what works in all things related to humans, including leadership. And to me, leadership is a very human activity because it requires language. And as far as we know, anyway, we're the only species in the universe that has language. And so I say we're the only ones who are doing leadership. If you look out in the animal world and all the rest of it, it's mostly domination, submission. There's command and control because they don't have this beautiful thing called language, but we do. And so we have this opportunity, and that's the intersection of love and then language and leadership, how those things all kind of weave together.
You're talking about, I just love the way you have interwoven those. And there's something that you had said in your book that I made a note of, and I really wanted to get you to explore this. Language is coordinating behavior versus language as communicating information. So, talk about that distinction because I think it's quite fascinating. And initially, coordinating behavior, before you answer, it can sound like, almost the command and control, like you were talking about. So, let's talk about the distinction there and also about the difference between communicating information.
Yeah, so this is another thing I owe to Humberto Maturana is in that book, he studied biology and evolution and talked about, what made us human. And he said something really powerful. He said, humans didn't invent language so that we could transfer information. He said language invented humans. And that what makes us different from our closest relatives, monkeys and apes, where we share 99.9% of our DNA, what makes us different is that we have a culture of coordination, cooperation, what he calls love. And that's what necessitates language. Because if you want communication and coordination, or what he then calls the consensual coordination of behavior. Mm. And so the full thing there is sort of there, to your point, is often, and Steve said the same when I shared this with him, is he initially heard that as like, oh, manipulation, command, control, something else. But the metaphor I use is like dancing, right? It's like it's consensual, it's coordination, it's cooperation, but that it's about behavior, action, interaction. It's not really that we've got information in our head and I need to somehow get it into your head. And to me, that really shifted things because when I started to see that really that I'd been using language or misusing language my whole life, I started to see all these possibilities open up. And it's kind of part of what goes into the power of systems and that distinction. But again, then to me, the power of language, and it's this possibility that leadership doesn't have to be related to command and control or domination and submission. It can be about what makes us human, cooperation and coordinating. And it often comes up with, and I appreciate you sharing that people struggle with it. And I don't know, maybe I struggled with it. I think I was just so excited at the time that there was some other possibility. I didn't notice it in the sense of like, oh, does that mean manipulate? And I think it's maybe also because Humberto does an amazing job in the book of really talking about how it's not manipulation. It really is like the David Hawkins book, Power versus Force, right? It's like it's love versus fear, right? It's like when you're coming from fear, that's when you would need to command or control or manipulate someone else because you would be afraid they're going to do the wrong thing or hurt you or something else. And if we're coming from power, coming from love, we would be totally open to coordinating and collaborating and cooperating, all those co words, which mean together, right? And so that to me is the difference because I love the etymology of words. Those co, like co creation, one of my favorite words. The co is the togetherness, and you can't have togetherness if you're commanding someone, if you're dominating someone, because usually the person who's being commanded or dominated or manipulated isn't consensually cooperating there, right?
Yeah.
They're being forced to do something.
Well, and thinking about that coordinating behavior, when you think about leadership, that intersection again, we're always as leaders, moving people or wanting to move people in a direction where they are behaving and doing things, taking action, not just listening. And you used the words, inspire and enrolling earlier. And that to me is what we're looking at here, using language in a way that does inspire people, that enrolls them so that they want to perform the behavior that's needed to get the desired result, whatever that might be.
Yeah. And it's the first time I heard it, I liked that it rhymed, right? But it was the switch from command and controlling to inspire and enrolling. And it was like,
Mm.
oh, I could make this shift. And it's a choice. Do I command or do I
Mhm.
inspire? Do I control or do I enroll? And to me, the only reason you would ever not want to inspire and enroll is if you are coming from fear. And that's why I always like to slow down people say, I'm not saying command and control is bad or wrong or we should never use it, right? Like if my house was on fire, I would not attempt to inspire and enroll my children into leaving. I would command and control them and I would pick them up if I had to, right? So it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just for me, what I notice is when I use, whenever I use force, like in physics, there's an equal and opposite counterforce. It's just in the world of physics, it's obvious. If I push on the wall pushes back. With people, because they're organic and nonlinear, it's like when you use force, the force isn't always obvious, the counterforce, right? So oftentimes when we use command and control or force, the counterforce comes up as resignation, gossiping, people doing not giving their 100% in the job because they were being, and so it's like just to start to be aware that if you're going to use force, you need to be aware and observe where the counterforce is coming. But also to me, I just got so excited that there was this possibility of you don't have to use force, right? And even like in my parenting and in other areas, it's like some of these it's so easy to go into command and control because I said so, because I'm your father, right? Like, and they're not that different from leadership because I said so, because I'm your leader, right? And so fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of us learn our leadership lessons from parenting lessons or teaching, right? And they tend to be very much based on command and control, force, using fear, punishment. Even rewards can be fear, like the fear if I don't get the reward versus this consensual coordination of behavior, this dancing together.
I love that. Well, there was another segment in the book where you were sharing, this was one of the last chapters where you and Steve were having a dialogue, and you shared this, to me, unforgettable story that Umberto had shared in his book about his nephew falling into the swimming pool. And I would love for you to share that story because there's such a key lesson for both parents and leaders from that incident. Would you
Sure.
please
Yeah,
tell us
I love
that?
that story as well because it had such an impact on me. Umberto was sharing that I think it was in Chile, and he was outside in the, I don't know if it was winter, but it was cool. And so he had his nephew over who was wearing a lot of clothing and had thick glasses on and just didn't see the pool as he was running and having fun as a child. And so he fell into the pool and screamed for help. And so by the time Umberto heard the scream, he came out. His nephew had made it to the side of the pool, and Umberto reached down, gave him his hand, pulled him out, or really what Umberto then realized was actually his nephew pulled himself out once he grabbed his hand. And they were sitting and he was talking with his nephew, and the nephew was crying and said, like, thank you for saving me. And Umberto said, you saved yourself, which kind of gave his nephew pause, right? Of like, what do you mean? No, you're the adult. You saved me. I was in trouble. And he said, no, if you hadn't have yelled for help, if you hadn't have made it to the side of the pool, and when I put my hand in, you grabbed it and just pulled really hard, like you pulled yourself out of the pool even. And that just started to shift his nephew's whole experience of that. And then he shared that he had to go to the washroom. And Umberto said, well, your clothes are all wet. Why don't you just pee your pants? It will warm you up. I have to go and get you a towel. And so he did. And even that, which would sometimes might be interpreted as an embarrassing thing, Umberto said later when he heard his nephew telling his sister, who was all excited, he said, I fell in the pool. I saved myself. I even peed my pants to warm myself up. Right. And it was such a shift from the initial fear-based interpretation, right? If I did something wrong and I was in trouble and I needed someone else to rescue me, versus seeing that there was something that wasn't coming from fear, right? And this is where Umberto shared on his side that it's easy in this case, not even the parent, the guardian of like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble. I wasn't watching him, like for him to come from fear, but he wasn't in that moment. And he was coming from love of like, okay, well, this happened. If I don't make it bad and wrong, he just had the relaxed nervous system in this space to create a very different experience with something that could have been a very traumatic story as it being told and retold and retold to something that became a very empowering and growth experience for his nephew.
Yeah, I just think of typical reactions that an adult might have when that happened, and the um, coming from fear or guilt themselves with that having happened, a natural response could be talking to the child in a way that causes them to feel guilt and shame. Why did
Yeah.
you get so close to the edge of the pool? All these things that could be said, which would have resulted in a very different experience. And thinking about that, tracking this child's life growing up and what a difference that made in his sense of self and his own capabilities. And to me, as I read that, and I was thinking of parents too, reacting to certain situations with their kids, but also in a leadership situation where when someone makes a big mistake, or they haven't followed through on something they said they were going to do, and the choices that leaders have in that moment to come from a place of fear or anger or some negative emotion versus sort of how Umberto did, coming back to your intersection of the three, coming from love. What would love do in that moment in a response that would help the person feel empowered, feel that they are capable rather than demeaning them? Talk about how you see that applying with leaders and people on their teams.
Yeah. So I love that you brought up this example because it is right at the intersection of those three things. And so on the intersection, the circle of love, my favorite distinction for love, and at first this might sound strange for people, but comes from Umberto, where he said love is simply letting everything appear without demands or expectations or prejudices. Like letting it appear and letting it be legitimate just because it appeared or just because it happened, right? So in that case, the nephew fell in the pool. That happened. And so love is saying, okay, that happened without any demands, like you shouldn't have. without expectations of you should be looking where you're going when you're running and not running around the pool, without prejudices of this is bad and wrong. I already know it's bad and wrong to fall into the pool because, and so to me, it was just this beautiful example of like, okay, he was coming from love of like, this happened and he didn't have any demands, expectations, or prejudices about it. And so then he could create because he wasn't coming from fear. And so he could use language. And that was how it was going to get created because the nephew had a certain creation of, you saved me, I'm in trouble. He was already crying. And the leadership component is one of my favorite distinctions for leadership is, or what I say to leaders all the time is, you're getting paid for what isn't. Like you get paid as a leader to create what isn't going to happen without you, not what was going to happen, not what's predictable. So in this case, it was very predictable. The nephew was already crying, very predictable that most people would get upset, that this would be a traumatic or at a minimum, a slightly bad story for the child. That's very predictable. So no leadership required to have that happen, right? Because whatever's predictable is going to happen without leadership. Leadership is creating what wasn't going to happen without the leader. And so it's this beautiful leadership moment of Umberto to create a very empowering, exciting growth story by coming from love, using language, stepping in as a leader. And to me, there's just something so beautiful that you can then apply it to work, right? Which is something my coach, Steve Chandler, said to me, I think just last week. He said, as a coach, you're always at a choice of do you grow the person or do you grow the dependency? And so often as leaders, that's what's happening. If you don't grow the person, you grow the dependency, which is where that was going to go. The child would have more dependency on adults and more dependency on being saved and more dependency on someone to tell them what to do and not do to be safe. And instead, what happened is Umberto grew the person, grew the child to see, actually, hold on, I'm very resilient. I can make mistakes and fall into pool, but I can then also save myself. I can ask for help. I can get to the side. I can use my resources and the helping resources. And to me, it's just this powerful, wonderful shift that you can use anywhere when you're coming from love, seeing the power of language and really stepping in as a leader to say, okay, do I choose to grow the person or am I going to grow the dependency? And that's often why I see leaders so much being the bottleneck everywhere, because they go around and they're growing and they have lots of dependency and lots of people dependent on them and their opinion and not growing individuals and growing leaders. That's why I love the work that you do. It's like, for me, leadership is about growing leaders, not growing followers, not growing dependent people. And so in that moment, Umberto was growing his nephew as a leader.
You know, I just love that sentence you shared about looking at as a leader, creating something that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't helped create that. That is worth taking many minutes to reflect on and imagine the power that a leader really has. Without using force, without using command and control, thinking about creating. And I know that that is something you work with your clients around a lot, is creation of their being, who they are being as a human, as a leader. Talk a little bit about the work that you do there around this whole idea of being.
Yeah, to me, the most powerful shift, right, is to know yourself as a creator, right? And to me, we can then say how you're being and who you're being. But it's like, okay, if I know myself as a creator of everything and anything, and to me, and how we create as humans is our languaging, it applies to leadership, it applies everywhere. And to me, that's the fundamental shift I'm inviting my clients. It's the behavior I'm attempting to coordinate with them, but obviously it needs to be consensual coordination. I can't force them. Early on in my coaching, I attempted to force people to, and I know it doesn't work well. And it's like, but there's something that when I'm standing there and role modeling it and demonstrating it, it's one of my other favorite. And I forget now if it was General Patton or someone who said leadership is three things: one, role modeling; two, role modeling; and three, role modeling. Right? It's like, okay, it's my opportunity as the coach to role model my way of leadership of like, I am a creator and my clients are creators. What they then go and do in the world and how they coordinate behavior when they start to see that it is all creation. And if we create coming from love, using language to coordinate and stepping in as a leader, which to me is to coordinate things that weren't going to happen. And that's why when we often look at great examples of leadership, and maybe not everyone will agree with the great examples, but the one I often use is like Kennedy saying, we'll put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and return him safely. That wasn't a prediction because it was actually unpredictable at the time because we didn't have the technology, but it was a creation. Or when Gandhi said, you know, India will be free, like that wasn't predictable. What was predictable was continued British rule, and right. And when he said India will be free and we'll do it non-violently, that was definitely not predictable, right? So it was an act of leadership. It was creating something that wasn't going to happen until, and why I love language, until it was spoken, right? Until the possibility didn't even exist before it was spoken. And those to me are great examples, you know, more so Gandhi or Martin Luther King, who has said, I have a dream, right? Like, again, that's not predictable. That is something that needs to be created, but coming from love, using language, leadership, the way you and I are talking about it, it is such a powerful combination.
So when you're working with someone who has limiting beliefs, let's say, about
Mm-hmm.
what's possible, and they're hearing you say, speak possibility, creating this with your words, and they're scratching their head going, um, yeah, I hear your examples, but for me, I've got this issue, I've got that issue. How do I make that real in my own life? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So for me, I get excited because I say they don't have any limiting beliefs. So that gives me a lot of power and freedom. And then I would slow them down for them to notice how they are creating as they speak about the problem. The fact that they're even calling it a problem. Now, some people call it a problem and get excited, right? And some people call it a problem. And so I'm always paying attention to whatever they are creating. Are they creating inspiration or empowerment? Or are they creating their own disempowerment, right? And creating fear. And so I would use their own example and slow them down. I was talking to a potential client this morning and it's just like slowing them down into how they were talking about, in this case, it was a relationship and how they were talking about how they were creating. It's why I said to you at the start of our call, I so appreciate how you create me, right? Because that's how you are creating me and who I am for you is your creation. And so I would then use their specific example and help them start to see that the words that they're choosing have huge impact. It's just most people don't notice because we live in a culture where people say talk is cheap. And to me, I say it's not cheap, right? But I get it when people think that talk is communicating information, or people will say things like, it was all talk, no action. That's just funny to me because for me, talk is some of our most critical action. So it just occurs over here that there can be no such thing as talk and no action. But maybe what they're pointing to is the kind of talking wasn't working. But when I make this shift to talk is not cheap, talk language more than just talking, because it's writing, it's all of it, is how I'm creating. I get to role model it in my conversations with my clients. And we pick the very thing that they are creating as they're speaking it, that they don't notice they're creating. They just think they're reporting on a situation. And we start to play with it and have a little bit of fun. And like the call this morning, it's like the person is almost like a different person, like their excitement level and the possibilities they see. And even there, I would notice I said the possibilities they see, it's actually the possibilities they say. We tend to use a very ocular metaphor for everything in our culture of seeing this, I can't see this. But possibility isn't a seeing phenomenon, it's a saying phenomenon, it's a speaking phenomenon. It gets created, it actually lives in language. And so that's why I love the work that I do is I get to play with people who I know are all powerful creators. They are so powerful, they can create that they're not a creator. And they can create limiting beliefs and they can create all sorts of things that they don't realize is coordinating their behavior. This is the shift, right? When you think it's communicating information, people are like, well, I have information in my head and I'm trying to communicate. They don't realize it's coordinating behavior. And everything you say to yourself is coordinating your own behavior. And
Mhm.
everything you say to other people is coordinating theirs, but it's also coordinating yours. And once you start to open up to the possibility, again, I wouldn't say it's the truth, but the possibility of that, you start to get access to the source of performance.
Everything you're saying is so thought-provoking and profound when you reflect on the power of that. And we haven't talked as much about your book, and I would love for you to help us understand how you define system and how it plays into everything we've been talking about.
Yeah. So we kind of have been talking about almost maybe like the behind the scenes of the book. But even the reason that the book is called The Power of Systems, like I know there's lots of books nowadays that might use that word, but for Steve and I, it was very intentional, the choice, because it is talking about the power of our systems. And to me, one of our most powerful systems is our system of languaging. The other one is our nervous system. And the book itself came from Steve's experience and my experience of just noticing that when we shifted what we and our clients talked about, their behavior really shifted. And so I just studied all of Steve's books because he'd written so much about this that when we shifted away from talking about things in our mind, and that's where I would use the word psychology, but even talking about thoughts and anything else that is sort of quote unquote mental, right? Where it's like, well, this courage or intention um, towards something that you could use your senses. So I'm a big fan of Fritz Perls, and he always said, lose your mind and come to your senses. So I love that saying of like, okay, lose your mind, come to your senses. What can you hear, see, feel, touch, smell, taste? That you can then start to see that the source of performance is something in our existing system. And when I can see it, I can hear it, I can feel it, I can touch it, which then means I can alter it and performance alters. And it really just shifts the powerful shift there is it takes people out of their self-consciousness, right? And looking at themselves like, what's wrong with me? Why do I procrastinate? Why don't I have courage? Why don't I? You asked me this question in the email you sent before, right? Of like, but when I got my job, my CEO told me I had everything I needed except for charisma. And so part of my first year was reading book. I'm like, where do I find this charisma thing? How do I get charisma? And I missed it because I was looking at it as some sort of psychological or personality thing versus seeing that it really just was a system. And what really where he was pointing to is I was tended to be very introverted and not very outspoken and as a head of sales, like running sales meetings and doing all the rest. I needed to shift my system or even how I ran meetings or how I communicated with people. But I missed it for so long because I didn't say it and talk about it in the systems paradigm. I was looking for some mystical, magical mental quality that I just couldn't find and kind of got stuck with. Like, I guess I'm not a charismatic person.
Yeah, that's such a good example. And I love this shift away from what's wrong with me to what's not working with my system and learning to recognize what my system is to begin with. And then seeing what is it about that system that's not producing the results I want. And so what tweaks do I need to make or what overhaul? It could be something
Mm-hmm.
small to something really big that I decide I want to do differently. the whole way you think of systems, you've talked about it being like this big blanket that overlays everything, so that if we can come to look at everything as a system, it keeps us from going down these rabbit holes of self-examination and shame and negative emotions that really don't serve us.
Yeah, it's what I had noticed that I hadn't noticed before, and my clients didn't often notice, is the way they talked about things, and often using what I would call psychological or mental or mind language, was coordinating the behavior of them taking themselves out of the game. And so the systems talk or systems language game, I sometimes talk about it, is like the effect of that language game is it gets people back into the game and learning, even if they're back in making mistakes. It's like, but that's where the learning comes from. But oftentimes in my life, when I had gone into the self-consciousness and the behavior it coordinated was not playing the game, often going to get research, spending time thinking about myself, self-criticism, all sorts of self something. But the impact was me not playing the game. So me not learning, me not making progress. And so big part of the systems and the power of systems is just this different way of talking coordinates a different behavior. And the main behavior it coordinates is experimenting, playing, dancing. We use these different metaphors, but it's like that's where all of the learning comes from.
And I love that language because it takes, again, the pressure off. It's not stressful, it's fun. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's such a difference when we look at that systems approach that you recommend. Trevor, is there anything I haven't asked you about today or that we haven't talked about that you're feeling, oh, this is one more thing I'd like to share before we wrap up?
I love the question. What comes up for me is, and it's in a couple of the chapters, but the real power of systems is that since everything I say is one system, I call it the great system, is that we can always slow down, plug into the system, and get guidance or ask for help. Right. And so sometimes there's like simple examples of like, well, I can ask Google or ChatGPT or a friend or whatever. But I sometimes worry when people read the book, they're looking for prescriptions or like, give me all the systems. And really, we're kind of just pointing in another direction and wanting people to start to experimenting with how do I plug in to this great system, this universe, and notice that I can get inspiration and creative ideas. And it's like the thing I often hear people say is like, I have my best ideas on vacation or in the shower, right? It has nothing to do with vacation or the shower, but those are great moments for me of letting go of my self-referential self-consciousness and saying like, okay, if I plug in or just open up, create some space, innovative ideas, crazy things can come. And it's like, oh, okay. So to me, what I love is that that's always there for everybody. Right. And Steve and I even sort of say, like, we didn't come up with the power of systems that sort of came through us. That's something that we just noticed in the great system and happened to be ones writing about it. But to me, I want invite people to really slow down and notice that that's there for everybody. Everybody has access to that. And that to me is the ultimate system.
To me, what you just said is fantastic, especially when we think about how busy we get doing, and not slowing down enough to listen
Mm-hmm.
for that inspiration because it's available to us.
Yes.
But we have to be in a place to hear it. So
Yes.
thank you. That's such a great addition. Everything that you've shared to me has just been such gold, Trevor, for me personally and for my listeners. So thank you. And please share with folks how they can connect with you, get a copy of your wonderful book, The Power of Systems, and learn more about your coaching work.
Sure. So the book is available on Amazon and all the various Amazon websites. My website is trevortimbeck.com. And if people search Trevor Timbeck in Google or LinkedIn or Facebook, they will find me. I am the only Trevor Timbeck in the world. My last name, Timbeck, my immediate family is the only Timbecks in the world. So I always laugh with people like maybe we're in the witness protection program, but it does make me very easy to find.
Great. Thank you so much. And Trevor, just thank you for who you are. The gift of you in the world is just magnificent. The insights you have, the integration you've done, that's allowing us to view things in a new way, like the power of language and that intersection of love, language, and leadership that I think is just very profound. So I just want you to know how much I appreciate you as a member of the human race and also as my friend and someone who has made a wonderful contribution to my listeners today. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor, and to me, the highest compliment of friend. So thank you for being my friend.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out the powerful tools we've created to help leaders strengthen their character and communication skills. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.